Our story with Maddie began in college, my sophomore year. I remember that day like it was yesterday. The bright fall sunshine, the rustle of fallen leaves underfoot, and her laughter, resonant and infectious, spreading across the campus courtyard. Maddie stood surrounded by her friends, her golden hair waving in the wind and her blue eyes shining, reflecting the sky. I couldn't take my eyes off her. At that moment, I didn't know that this girl would change my whole life, would be the cause of my greatest happiness and deepest pain. Our acquaintance happened thanks to mutual friends. We found ourselves in the same company at a party, and I was struck not only by her beauty, but also by her sharp mind and sense of humor. Maddie was able to maintain a conversation on any topic, from classical literature to the latest scientific discoveries. Her energy and vitality attracted people, and I was no exception. For the first time, we just socialized in the company of friends. I enjoyed every minute spent with her, but I did not dare to make the first step. Maddie seemed unattainable, too bright for an ordinary guy like me. But fate had it differently. One day we found ourselves in the same group to work on a semester project. Long hours spent together in the library and cafeteria gradually brought us closer together. I learned that behind the outward brilliance was a vulnerable soul, that Maddie had her own fears and doubts, just like the rest of us. Our first kiss was spontaneous. We'd stayed up late discussing a project, and when we left the library, we were greeted by a cool spring night. I offered to walk Maddie to her dorm. On the way, we talked about the stars, about the future, about dreams. And then, quite unexpectedly, she stopped, looked me in the eye, and kissed me. From that moment on, it was like a kaleidoscope. We became inseparable. We studied together, spent our free time together, dreamed about the future together. Maddie inspired me to be a better person, to strive for more. Thanks to her, I became more confident in myself, began to participate more actively in student life. Our relationship was not perfect. There were quarrels and misunderstandings, but we always found a way to overcome our differences. I felt like together we could handle anything. When it came time to graduate, we both got job offers in different cities. That was our first major test. We had a long discussion about what to do next and finally decided that our relationship was more important than our career prospects. I turned down an attractive offer in New York and stayed with Maddie in our hometown. The first year after college wasn't easy. We were both adjusting to adult life, trying to find ourselves in our professions. There were times when I doubted the rightness of my decision to stay, but one look at Maddie dispelled all doubts. Her support and faith in me helped me to overcome all the difficulties. I proposed on our third anniversary. We climbed to the observation deck of the tallest building in the city. All around us was the night city, twinkling with thousands of lights. I got down on one knee and pulled out the ring. Maddie looked surprised, but her eyes shone with happiness. She said yes before I could finish my carefully prepared speech. We hugged, and it felt like the whole world disappeared, leaving just the two of us on top of the world. The next months flew by in a whirlwind of wedding preparations. We argued about details, made up, argued again, but all these little things seemed so insignificant compared to our love. Maddie was in her element, planning every detail of the ceremony and reception. I watched her enthusiasm with fondness, thinking about how lucky I was. The wedding day was sunny and warm, as if nature itself was blessing our union. Maddie was dazzlingly beautiful in her white dress. As she walked down the aisle, I couldn't hold back the tears of happiness. We exchanged vows in front of our families and friends, promising to love and support each other for better and for worse. The reception went like a fairy tale. We danced, we laughed, we accepted congratulations. Maddie was glowing with happiness, and I couldn't get enough of her. At that moment, I was sure that we had a long and happy life ahead of us. We spent our honeymoon in Europe, traveling through small towns and enjoying each other's company. We made plans for the future, dreamed about the house we would buy, about the children we would raise together. Every day was filled with new impressions and discoveries, but the most important discovery for me was Maddie. I fell in love with her anew every day. Back home, we plunged into everyday life. Work, chores, going out with friends. It all became part of our family routine. But even on the most ordinary days, I found moments to remind Maddie of my love. I left a note with tender words or brought her favorite flowers for no reason. The years flew by. We bought a small house in the suburbs, got a dog. Our careers were going well. Maddie was promoted in her design firm, and I found my calling in financial consulting. We supported each other's professional growth and enjoyed each other's successes. Of course, not everything was perfect. There were quarrels. There were moments of misunderstanding. Sometimes we were tired of work and took it out on each other. But we always found a way to make up, discuss problems, and become even closer. Each obstacle we overcame seemed to only strengthen our marriage. Our 5th wedding anniversary was approaching. I wanted to make this day special, to show Maddie how much she meant to me. I planned a surprise romantic dinner at the restaurant where we'd first celebrated our anniversary in college, followed by a walk along the waterfront where we'd loved to walk in the early years of our relationship. I was full of hope and plans for the future, dreaming of growing old together, of sitting in rocking chairs on the veranda of our home, surrounded by grandchildren. Maddie was my world, my support, my best friend. I couldn't imagine my life without her. But fate was preparing me for a cruel surprise. What was supposed to be a day to celebrate our love turned into the beginning of the end. I didn't know yet that Maddie's confession would turn my life upside down, shattering everything I had believed in for the past 5 years. The morning of our 5th anniversary began as usual. I woke up before Maddie, got out of bed quietly, trying not to wake her, and headed to the kitchen to make breakfast. It had become our little tradition to start our special days with each other's favorite foods. For Maddie, I made French toast with strawberries and whipped cream and brewed her favorite coffee. When breakfast was ready, I returned to the bedroom with the tray. Maddie was already awake and sitting up in bed, checking something on her phone. I set the tray on the bedside table and kissed her, wishing her a happy anniversary. Maddie smiled, but her smile seemed a little strained to me. She thanked me for breakfast and started eating, but I noticed she was moving the food around on her plate more than actually eating. I started talking about my plans for the evening, the restaurant I'd booked, the walk along the waterfront. Maddie listened with slight absent-mindedness, nodding in all the right places, but I could sense that her thoughts were somewhere far away. When I finished, she simply said she had to get to work early and started packing. I felt a prick of disappointment. We usually allowed ourselves to be a little late on days like this, enjoying each other's company. The day at work dragged on endlessly. I glanced at the clock every now and then, looking forward to getting home and getting ready for the evening. I sent Maddie a few messages throughout the day, but she replied short and dry. Again, I tried to convince myself that she was just busy, but an uneasy feeling began to brew somewhere in the back of my mind. Returning home, I found Maddie already there. She was sitting on the couch, engrossed in her laptop. When I walked in, she quickly closed the lid and stood up, smiling strainedly. We exchanged a few sentences about the day before, and Maddie headed into the bedroom to get ready to go out. As she was getting ready, I noticed that her behavior seemed odd. She was moving a little nervously, avoiding direct eye contact. When I tried to hug her, she tensed up before relaxing into my embrace. It wasn't like the Maddie I knew, but I chalked it up to stress at work. In the restaurant, the atmosphere was tense. Maddie tried to keep the conversation going, but her laughter sounded fake, and her eyes remained serious. She barely touched her food, explaining that she had eaten a heavy lunch at work. I noticed that she checked her phone a lot, though we usually tried to keep our minds off gadgets during special evenings. After dinner, we went to the waterfront. I took Maddie's hand, but her fingers were cold and lifeless in my palm. We walked in silence, looking out at the water. I tried to remember the last time I'd felt such detachment between us, but I couldn't. When we got home, Maddie said she was tired and wanted to go to bed. I tried to talk to her, to ask if everything was okay, but she assured me she was just overworked at work. Her goodnight kiss was quick and perfunctory. I lay awake, listening to Maddie's steady breathing next to me. My mind was spinning with thoughts of the past day, of my wife's strange behavior. Something was wrong. I could feel it with my whole being. But what was it? Maybe I'd missed something? Maybe Maddie was trying to tell me something and I didn't hear? In the morning, Maddie left for work earlier than usual. The note on the kitchen table said, "Urgent client meeting. See you tonight. Love, M." Those words should have reassured me, but somehow they only made me more anxious. Over the next few days, I watched Maddie, trying to figure out what was going on. She tried to act normal, making dinner, asking about my day, watching TV with me in the evening. But I noticed little details, the way she flinched when her phone rang, how often she stayed late at work, how she avoided talking about the future. Maddie tried to play the role of the perfect wife, but she wasn't very good at it. Her smiles didn't reach her eyes. Her touch became mechanical. It was like she was following a well-rehearsed script, but without the sincerity and warmth that had always been the foundation of our relationship. I tried to talk to her about it, to ask her what was bothering her, but Maddie always found a way to avoid the conversation. She would cite fatigue, stress at work, anything to avoid answering my questions. Gradually, I began to notice other changes. Maddie started paying more attention to her appearance, going to the gym more often. She bought several new outfits that were more revealing than her usual clothes. When I tried to compliment her, she just shrugged and said she wanted to update her closet a bit. One evening, I came home earlier than usual and found Maddie talking on the phone. She was talking quietly, but I managed to hear the end of the sentence. Can't talk right now. Later. When Maddie saw me, she quickly ended the conversation and tried to pretend nothing had happened. But I noticed her hands trembling as she tucked her phone into her pocket. With each passing day, the tension between us grew. I felt like I was losing Maddie, that she was slipping away from me, but I didn't know how to stop it. She continued to play the role of caring wife, but it was becoming less and less convincing. I saw something in her eyes that looked like guilt, mixed with determination, and it scared me more than anything. I began to analyze her every word, every gesture, trying to find answers to the questions I was afraid to ask out loud. Why had she changed so much? What or who was behind this change? And most importantly, was there anything left of the Maddie I'd fallen in love with 5 years ago? Our lives had become a strange play where we both played our parts, but behind the facade of normality was a growing chasm. I felt that we were approaching some kind of tipping point after which nothing would ever be the same again. But I could not have foreseen how painful that moment of truth would be. The days after our 5th anniversary merged for me into one endless stream of anxious thoughts and observations. I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, that I was exaggerating, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed in our relationship with Maddie. Every morning started the same way, with Maddie hurriedly getting ready for work, barely having time for coffee. Her goodbye kisses became short and mechanical. When I tried to hug her, she tensed, as if my touch caused her physical discomfort. One morning, when Maddie was ready to leave, I asked, "Why don't we have dinner together tonight? It's been a while since we've spent time just the two of us." Maddie froze for a moment, then turned to me with a strained smile. "Sorry, honey. I have an important meeting with a client today. Maybe another time?" I nodded, trying to hide my disappointment. This was the 3rd time this week that Maddie had refused to have dinner together. We used to always make time for each other despite the workload at work. Evenings had become the hardest time of day. Maddie would come home late, often after 9 o'clock. She would talk about a complicated project, a demanding client, but her explanations sounded unconvincing. I noticed that she smelled of perfume, which she didn't usually use, and sometimes I caught a faint whiff of alcohol. One evening, when Maddie was late again, I decided to make dinner. I wanted to do something nice. Maybe it would help us bond again. I chose her favorite dish, lasagna from her grandmother's recipe. When Maddie finally got home, I greeted her with a smile. "Surprise! I made your favorite lasagna." Maddie looked at the set table with a kind of strange expression on her face. "Oh, Walter, that's so sweet of you, but I've already eaten with my coworkers. We were celebrating the completion of a project." I felt the smile slide off my face. "But you could have called and warned me." Maddie shrugged. "Sorry, I didn't think you'd be cooking. Usually you just order something." Those words hit me. Did she really think I wasn't capable of cooking dinner? Or was it just an excuse? I often lay awake at night, listening to Maddie's breathing next to me. Sometimes I thought she was awake too, but pretending to be asleep to avoid talking. I thought back to our early years together, when we could talk for hours, sharing our deepest thoughts and dreams. Where had all that gone? At work, I became distracted. Colleagues noticed my condition, but I dismissed it by talking about sleep deprivation and stress. The truth was too painful to say out loud. To admit that my marriage was crumbling would be to make it real. One day, while looking through our photos together on the computer, I came across a folder of recent shots of Maddie. She was at some party I knew nothing about. In the pictures, Maddie looked happy and relaxed, in a way I hadn't seen her in a long time. Next to her, some man, a tall blonde man with a charming smile, kept flashing by her side. They stood too close together for normal co-workers. Her heart clenched with pain and jealousy. Who was this man? Why had Maddie never mentioned him? I wanted to ask her that, but every time I gathered my wits, something stopped me. Fear of hearing the truth that could ruin everything we had? As the weeks went by, the tension between us grew. Maddie was staying late at work more and more often, less and less likely to return my calls and texts. When we did get home together, she was engrossed in her phone or laptop, barely noticing my presence. I tried to initiate a conversation, asking about her day, about work, but only got one-word answers. When I suggested going out together, or just watching a movie, Maddie always found a reason to decline. "Maddie, why don't we go to that new restaurant you were talking about this weekend?" I asked one night. She didn't even look up from the phone. "Sorry, Walter, I have plans with my girlfriends. Maybe another time." I felt my insides tighten. When would the another time come? Would there even be one? One day, while sorting through things in my closet, I came across an unfamiliar box. Inside were concert tickets for a band Maddie loved, dated last month. I didn't know about this concert. Maddie had said at the time that she was traveling on a business trip. This discovery was a turning point. I could no longer ignore the obvious. Maddie was lying to me, probably a long time ago. But why? What was she hiding? I began to watch her behavior more closely, trying to find other signs of deception. I noticed that she always kept her phone with her and never left it unattended. When texts came in, she would quickly check them and immediately put her phone away, as if she was afraid I might see the screen. One night, while Maddie was in the shower, her phone rang. I saw the name on the screen. Jack. Who was Jack? Maddie had never mentioned him. When she came out of the bathroom, I asked casually, "Some Jack called you. Who is it?" Maddie froze for a moment, then nonchalantly replied, "Oh, it's a new coworker. Something work-related, I guess." But I noticed how pale she turned, how her voice trembled. She was clearly lying, and it was breaking my heart. I started noticing other little things, new outfits I hadn't seen before, more attention to makeup and hair, strange work meetings on the weekends. It was all adding up to a picture I didn't want to see, but couldn't ignore. Thoughts of Maddie's possible infidelity kept me on my toes. I tried to find other explanations for her behavior, but each time I came back to this painful version. Could she be having an affair with this Jack guy? Or that blonde guy in the pictures? I felt like I was losing ground beneath my feet. The woman I loved most in the world, the one I planned to spend my life with, had turned into a stranger. I didn't recognize her behavior. I didn't understand her motives. Where was the Maddie who swore to love me for better or for worse? One night I couldn't stand it anymore and decided to talk to her straight. I bought a bottle of wine that we had loved in the early years of our marriage and made dinner. When Maddie got home, I met her in the living room. "Maddie, we need to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. She looked at me warily. "About what?" "About us. About what's been going on between us lately." Maddie tensed but sat down across from me. I started talking about how I felt, how much our relationship had changed, how much I missed our former intimacy. I asked her bluntly if she was happy in our marriage. Maddie listened in silence, her face impenetrable. When I finished, she took a deep breath and said, "Walter, I don't know what to say. I need time to think." Those words didn't bring relief, but they weren't a final verdict either. I felt that we were standing on the edge of a precipice, and the next step could either save our marriage or destroy it completely. We went to our separate rooms, each immersed in his own thoughts. I couldn't sleep, replaying our conversation in my head, trying to figure out what would happen next. In the morning, Maddie left for work earlier than usual without saying a word. All day I was on pins and needles waiting for her to return. What would she decide? Would she be willing to fight for our marriage, or would she choose to end it? The suspense was killing me. That evening when Maddie came home, I saw determination in her eyes. She sat across from me and said, "Walter, we really need to have a serious talk." I felt my heart freeze in anticipation of her words. Whatever she said next, I knew it would change our lives forever. Maddie's words hung in the air, filling the room with a heavy sense of foreboding. I looked at her, trying to read something in her eyes, but all I saw was determination and something resembling relief. My heart was beating so hard that it felt like it was about to jump out of my chest. When Maddie began to speak, her voice sounded calm, almost detached. She confessed the affair as if she were talking about the weather or what she'd bought at the store. The casualness of her tone hurt me even more than the words themselves. Maddie told me how she'd cheated on me on our wedding day. She talked about Jack, her coworker with whom she always had some tension, about how he came to her hotel before the ceremony and how she gave in to temptation. I listened to her confession, feeling everything crumble inside me. Every word Maddie said was like a hammer blow, shattering my memories of our happy day. I remembered how she walked down the aisle, how we exchanged vows. All this time, she was already carrying this terrible secret inside her. But what struck me most was the complete lack of remorse in Maddie's voice. She spoke of the affair as if it were something inevitable, almost natural. There was no hint of regret or shame in her tone. When I was finally able to speak, my voice shook with restrained emotion. I asked why she'd married me if she had feelings for someone else. Maddie shrugged as if the question had never really bothered her. She explained that she'd never taken our marriage seriously. For her, it was more of a social expectation than a genuine desire. She spoke of our relationship as something superficial that never had deep roots. With every word Maddie said, I could feel the chasm between us growing. The woman sitting in front of me was a stranger. I couldn't understand how I'd missed it before, how I could mistake her coldness for fatigue, her aloofness for simply being busy at work. Maddie continued her story, moving from one affair to the next. She talked about her encounters with Jack and other men as if she were listing a shopping list. Her indifference to my feelings, to the way her words broke my heart, was almost palpable. When she finished speaking, a heavy silence hung in the room. I expected to feel anger, rage, the urge to scream and blame. But instead, all I felt was a deep, all-consuming emptiness. Maddie said she was leaving me. She said it as calmly as she said anything else. The decision seemed to carry no emotional weight for her. She spoke of our breakup as something inevitable and even desirable. I looked at her, trying to see a shadow of the woman I had fallen in love with 5 years ago. But there was a complete stranger sitting in front of me. Maddie seemed almost relieved, as if she'd lifted a heavy weight off her shoulders. She stood up, saying she'd already packed her things and would find a place to stay for the near future. Her willingness to walk away so easily, to leave behind 5 years of life together, had been the final blow. When the door closed behind Maddie, I was left sitting in a daze. My world had crumbled, but the woman who had shattered it didn't even turn around to look at the wreckage. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I went over every moment of our life together, trying to figure out where things had gone wrong. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that our marriage had been built on lies from the beginning. Maddie called several times to discuss the practicalities of divorce. Her voice on the phone sounded businesslike and detached, as if we were discussing some kind of business deal rather than the end of our marriage. I tried to find the strength to be angry with her, to hate her for betraying me. But instead, all I felt was a deep, overpowering sadness. Sadness not only for the love lost, but also for the fact that the person I trusted most in the world was capable of such a cold, calculating betrayal. Friends and family were shocked at the news of our divorce. To everyone, we were the perfect couple, an example of a strong relationship. I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth about Maddie's cheating. Partly out of shame, partly because I still couldn't quite believe it was real. Maddie seemed to have made an easy transition to her new life. Through mutual acquaintances, I learned that she was already openly dating Jack. They were showing up together at company parties and restaurants as if those 5 years of marriage had never happened. Her ability to move on so quickly while I was still trying to pick up the pieces of my life, hurt almost physically. I couldn't understand how a person could be so indifferent to the feelings of another, especially someone they had lived with for so many years. Gradually, I began to realize that Maddie had never truly loved me. To her, our marriage was a convenient arrangement, a social status, but not the union of two loving hearts that it had been to me. The realization was bittersweet, but at the same time it helped me begin the healing process. I immersed myself in my work, trying to fill the void left by Maddie's departure. I spent hours in the office, taking on extra projects. Colleagues noticed a change in my behavior, but I shrugged it off by talking about wanting to advance my career. At night, lying in my empty bed, I often thought about how I could have been so blind. How could I not notice that the woman next to me was living a double life? But then I remembered how skillfully Maddie had played the role of loving wife, how convincingly she had lied all those years. The divorce went surprisingly smoothly. Maddie had no claim to most of our joint property. She just seemed to want to get it over with and start a new life. Her indifference to the material side of our marriage was further proof of how little it all meant to her. Every meeting with Maddie during the divorce proceedings was a challenge. She seemed calm, even happy, while I felt devastated. Her ability to cross off 5 years of our life together so easily amazed me. Slowly, I began to realize that my pain wasn't so much from losing Maddie as it was from losing the illusion I'd lived in all those years. I wasn't mourning a real relationship, but the perfect picture I had painted for myself. My friends tried to support me, calling me to parties, introducing me to new people. But I wasn't ready. Maddie's betrayal had left a deep scar on my soul, and the thought of a new relationship brought only fear and disgust. One day, while going through some old things, I came across our wedding photo. Maddie looked so happy in it, so in love. I realized now that it was all just an elaborate game. In that moment, I realized for the first time how deeply I had been deceived. I stared at that photograph for a long time, remembering the day that I had thought was the beginning of our happy life together. I knew now that it was the day of the biggest betrayal of all. A day when the woman who had sworn me eternal love was already carrying the seed of a lie that would eventually destroy our marriage. With a heavy heart, I put the picture away in a faraway drawer. It was another step toward accepting reality, toward realizing that the Maddie I loved had never existed. There was only an illusion created by my imagination and her skillful pretenses. A few months passed. The divorce was finalized, and Maddie was officially no longer my wife. I expected this moment to bring some sort of closure, a closing of this chapter of my life. But instead, all I felt was emptiness and uncertainty. Maddie seemed to have already fully recovered from our separation. Through mutual acquaintances, I learned that she had moved in with Jack, gotten a promotion at work. Her life was moving forward, while mine seemed to be frozen in place. I tried to find the strength to move on, but each step was difficult. Maddie's betrayal had undermined my faith in people, my ability to trust. I knew I had a long road to recovery, but I wasn't sure where to start. The days after the divorce blended into one endless gray fog for me. I mechanically went to work, performed my duties, but inside, I felt nothing but emptiness. The world around me continued to rotate, but it was as if I was frozen in time, unable to move forward. The apartment, once filled with laughter and warmth, now seemed cold and alien. I couldn't bring myself to put away Maddie's things she'd left behind. Her toothbrush was still in a glass in the bathroom, her favorite mug on the kitchen shelf. These little things were painful reminders of a life that had slipped away from me. Nights were the hardest time. I lay awake for hours, replaying every moment of our life together in my head, trying to figure out where it all went wrong. Every memory, once precious, was now poisoned by the knowledge of Maddie's betrayal. My friends tried to support me, calling me to visit, offering me entertainment. But I found more and more reasons to refuse. The thought of pretending to be cheerful and carefree seemed unbearable. Gradually, the calls became less frequent, the invitations more and more formal. I realized that I was pushing people away, but I couldn't find the strength to change anything. At work, I immersed myself in projects, often staying late at the office. It helped take my mind off Maddie, but as soon as I got home, reality hit me with a new force. Colleagues noticed the change in my behavior. Some tried to bring it up, but I always found a way to deflect the conversation. One evening, on my way home from work, I happened to see Maddie at a coffee shop. She was sitting at a table with Jack, laughing at something he was saying. They looked so happy, so carefree. The sight hit me as if physically. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, unable to look away. Maddie turned her head, and for a moment our eyes met. But she only nodded slightly and returned to the conversation as if I were a casual acquaintance, not the man she'd spent 5 years of her life with. That moment was the turning point. I realized that while I was stuck in the past, agonizing over the pain of betrayal, Maddie had moved on. She didn't waste time with regrets or remorse. To her, our marriage was just a chapter she'd turned over and forgotten. That night, I drank myself into oblivion for the first time. The alcohol dulled the pain, allowed me to forget reality for a few hours. I woke up in the morning with a terrible headache and a sense of shame, but also with a dangerous realization. It was the first time in a long time that I hadn't felt that all-consuming emptiness. Gradually, alcohol became my companion in the evenings. At first, it was just a couple of glasses of wine at dinner to relax. Then it was a glass of whiskey before bed to drown out my thoughts. It didn't take long for me to start drinking more and more. I knew it was unhealthy behavior, but I couldn't stop. Alcohol gave me the illusion of control, allowed me to forget about the pain for a while. In the drunken haze, the world seemed less cruel and the future less frightening. My work began to suffer. I started being late, making mistakes I never would have made before. Colleagues looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance. My boss called me in for a serious talk, warning me that if things didn't change, I would have to look for a new job. This warning should have been a wake-up call for me, a wake-up call to come to my senses. But instead, I only sank deeper into my self-destructive behavior. Work was the last thing that connected me to a normal life, and now even that was slipping away. One night, at a particularly difficult moment, I dialed Maddie's number. I knew it was a bad idea, but I couldn't resist the urge to hear her voice. When she answered, I couldn't utter a word. Just listened to her hello repeated in an increasingly irritated manner until she hung up. It was as if that silence on the phone symbolized the emptiness that was left in my life after she left. My parents, concerned about my condition, offered to come and stay with me for a while. But I refused, not wanting them to see what my life had become. I lied to them, telling them that everything was fine, that I was coping. But every day the lies became more and more obvious, even to myself. In my rare moments of sobriety, I realized I was sliding into the abyss, but the thought of asking for help seemed unbearable. I felt shame for my weakness, for letting Maddie's betrayal ruin my life like that. My health began to deteriorate. I lost my appetite, lost weight, felt tired all the time. But even that couldn't make me stop. Alcohol became the only thing that kept me functioning, the only way to dull the pain and emptiness inside. Days merged into weeks, weeks into months. I existed in some kind of gray fog, not really living. My apartment became a den where I only went to get drunk and forget myself. Bills went unpaid, mail piled up on my desk. I stopped answering calls from friends and family, sinking into my own world of pain and alcoholic oblivion. One morning I woke up on the bathroom floor with no memory of how I got there. It was the moment I was first truly scared. Scared not of what was happening to me, but that I didn't care. I looked at my reflection in the mirror and didn't recognize the person who was looking back at me. This episode should have been a wake-up call for me, a moment of awakening. But instead, I just opened a new bottle to drown out that fear. I knew I was destroying myself, but I couldn't stop. The pain of Maddie's betrayal was still too strong, and alcohol seemed like the only way to deal with it. My life became a vicious cycle. Work, when I could make myself go. Drink, sleep, repeat. I stopped taking care of my appearance, rarely shaving or changing my clothes. Colleagues at work tried to stay away from me, and my boss increasingly hinted that my time with the company was coming to an end. One evening, as I sat at home staring at an empty TV with a bottle in my hand, the doorbell rang. I ignored it, hoping the intruder would leave. But the bell rang again, this time more insistently. I struggled to get up and made my way to the door. One evening, as I sat at home, staring at the empty TV with a bottle in my hand, the doorbell rang. I ignored it, hoping the intruder would leave. But the bell rang again, this time more insistently. I struggled to get up and made my way to the door. On the doorstep stood Alex, my best friend, whom I hadn't seen in months. He looked worried and determined. Without waiting for an invitation, he entered the apartment and looked around. His gaze stopped at the empty bottles scattered around the room, the unwashed dishes in the sink, my unkempt appearance. "Walter, this can't go on," Alex said, and I heard a mixture of pain and determination in his voice. "We're all worried about you. You're not answering your cell phone. You're not coming to meetings. What's going on with you?" I wanted to answer, to say that everything was fine, that I was coping, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I just sank down on the couch, feeling the tears start to flow down my cheeks. They were the first tears I'd shed since Maddie left. Alex sat down next to me, putting his hand on my shoulder. "You're not alone, friend," he said quietly. "We're here to help you, but you have to let us do it." At that moment, something inside me broke. All the walls I had built up around me came tumbling down. I started talking, rambling and confused, spewing out all the pain and despair that had built up over the months. Alex listened silently, not interrupting, just letting me talk. When I finally stopped talking, exhausted from the emotional outburst, Alex said, "Walter, you need help, professional help. You can't keep living like this." I knew he was right, but the thought of admitting my weakness, of asking for help, still scared me. "I don't know if I can," I whispered. "You can," Alex replied firmly, "because you're stronger than you think you are, and because you have us, your friends and family. We're going to help you through this." In his words, I heard the support and care that I'd been missing all these months, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a faint glimmer of hope. Alex's words echoed in my head long after he left. His visit was like waking me up from a long, agonizing sleep. For the first time in months, I felt something akin to hope. Maybe all was not truly lost. Maybe I could get out of this abyss. The next day, Alex returned as promised. He brought with him information about AA groups and contacts for a psychologist specializing in addiction and trauma recovery. I looked at those papers with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. Part of me wanted to crumple them up and throw them away, to return to the familiar numbness of alcoholic oblivion. But the other part, the part that had been awakened by Alex's visit, clung to this opportunity to change my life. "I'll go with you to the first meeting if you want," Alex offered. His encouragement gave me strength, and I nodded, agreeing. The first AA meeting was a real challenge for me. I was sitting in a circle of strangers, listening to their stories, and I felt out of place. Part of me was still in denial that I had a problem. "I'm not like them," I convinced myself. "I can quit at any time, I just don't want to yet." But when it was my turn to speak, the words flowed on their own. I talked about Maddie, about the betrayal, about how alcohol had become my way of escaping the pain. And for the first time in a long time, I felt understood. The people in the group nodded, and in their eyes I saw sympathy and support. After the meeting, I felt a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. Alex, who was waiting for me outside, asked me how it had gone. I couldn't find the words to describe how I felt, but he seemed to understand without words. The next week, I went to see a psychologist. Dr. Lena Harris turned out to be a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a calm voice. She listened carefully to my story without interrupting or judging. "Walter," she said at the end of the session, "you've been through a very difficult ordeal. The fact that you are here today is already a big step forward. But remember, recovery is a process. It will take time and effort to overcome this trauma and addiction." I nodded, feeling oddly relieved by her words. For the first time, someone had called what had happened to me a trauma. It was as if it legitimized my pain, my condition. I'm not just a weak person who can't handle a breakup. I'm a person who has experienced betrayal and is trying to deal with the aftermath. The next few weeks passed at a sort of feverish pace. I continued to go to AA meetings and to Dr. Harris. Alex checked in regularly to see how I was doing. sometimes just visiting, sometimes taking me out for a walk or a movie. Gradually, I began to notice changes. Physically, I felt better. Headaches became less frequent. My appetite increased. I started sleeping better at night, although nightmares still plagued me sometimes. I became more focused at work and even received praise from my boss for a successfully completed project. But the further I went, the harder it became to stick to the new regimen. AA meetings, which at first gave me a sense of support and understanding, now seemed tedious. I began to skip them, finding various excuses. Sessions with Dr. Harris also became a drag. Digging into the past, analyzing my feelings for Maddie, all of it made me uncomfortable. I felt like I was stuck, that the constant talk of betrayal was only nagging old wounds, keeping me from moving forward. Alex noticed these changes. He started calling more often, more insistently suggesting we meet. But I found more and more reasons to refuse. I thought I was strong enough to cope on my own. One evening, when I canceled our meeting once again, citing fatigue, Alex suddenly appeared at my door. He looked worried and determined. "Walter, what's going on?" he asked without preamble. "You're skipping meetings, you stopped going to the counselor. You're pushing away everyone who's trying to help you again." I felt the irritation building up inside. Who is he to tell me what to do? I'm a grown man. I can decide for myself what I need. "I'm fine, Alex," I replied, trying to stay calm. "I just need some space. I appreciate your help, but I can handle myself right now." Alex shook his head. "You're not okay, Walter. You're just hiding from reality again. You may not be drinking now, but you're still running away from your problems." His words hit a nerve. I felt anger rise up inside of me. "You don't know what I've been through," I shouted out. "You have no right to judge me. I don't need your pity or your advice. Just leave me alone." Alex looked stunned by my outburst. He tried to say something, but I had already slammed the door in his face. My heart was pounding, my hands were shaking. Part of me wanted to open the door to apologize, but pride wouldn't let me do it. I heard Alex stand outside the door for a while longer. Then his footsteps slowly drifted away down the hallway. As soon as the sound of his footsteps faded, a wave of shame and regret came over me. I had just pushed away my best friend, the man who had been there for me in my worst moments. But instead of trying to make things right, I did what I knew best. I started looking for excuses for my behavior. Alex puts too much pressure on me. He doesn't realize that I need time. He treats me like a child who can't take care of himself. That night I couldn't sleep for a long time. My thoughts swirled around the fight with Alex, around Maddie, around everything that had happened in the last few months. I could feel the old demons rearing their heads again. The urge to drink grew stronger and stronger. The next morning I woke up feeling like I had made a terrible mistake. I reached for the phone, thinking about calling Alex and apologizing. But pride took over again. I convinced myself that he needed time to cool off, that it was better to wait a few days. Days turned into weeks. Alex didn't call or come around anymore. I told myself that this was even better, that I needed to learn to cope on my own. But in reality, I felt more alone than ever. I stopped going to AA meetings and to the counselor, convinced myself that I didn't need it anymore. I don't drink, so I'm fine, right? But inside, I knew it was a lie. I may not have been drinking, but the feeling of emptiness and despair hadn't gone away. At work, I began to distance myself from my coworkers again. My improvement in productivity proved to be temporary. I started making mistakes again, missing deadlines. My boss called me on the carpet again, but this time his tone was no longer warning, but ultimatum. At home, I spent my evenings staring at the TV or wandering aimlessly on the internet. I told myself that this was normal, that I just needed time. But deep inside, I knew I was sliding back into the same abyss I'd so recently tried to climb out of. Thoughts of Maddie, which had receded into the background for a while, began to haunt me again. I caught myself checking her social media pages, trying to find out what was going on in her life. Every picture of her looking happy, every post about her success at work was like a knife in my heart. One evening, while browsing through my newsfeed, I came across a picture of Maddie with Jack. They were at some party, both glowing and happy. The caption under the photo read, "With the love of my life." Those words hit me as if physically. I felt the ground go from under my feet. In that moment, all my attempts to hold on, all my beliefs that I was coping, crumbled. I felt a need for alcohol that I hadn't felt in a long time. I needed something to dull the pain, to not feel again. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the apartment. The nearest store was closed, but I knew a bar nearby that was open late. My legs carried me there on their own. Part of me was screaming that this was a mistake, that I was ruining everything I'd accomplished in the last few months. But the other part, the part that longed for oblivion, was stronger. I could already see the sign for the bar when my phone rang. I pulled it out of my pocket and saw Alex's name on the screen. For a moment I froze, not knowing what to do. Part of me wanted to answer it, to tell him everything, to ask for help. But fear and shame were stronger. I dropped the call and turned my phone off. Standing in front of the bar door, I felt my whole being torn apart. One step and I would undo all my efforts, all my attempts to start a new life. But this step seemed so easy, so tempting. Just walk in, order a drink, and all the problems would disappear. The days blended into a monotonous gray mass. I couldn't tell the difference between morning and evening. My apartment turned into a den littered with empty bottles and pizza boxes. Bags of trash piled up not only inside, but also by the front door, spreading a foul odor throughout the floor. The job that had once been my pride now seemed like a distant memory. I missed days, not even bothering to call to give notice. When I did show up at the office, I reeked of booze and my appearance shocked my coworkers. No wonder my boss called me in one morning. His face was grim and his eyes were filled with disappointment. "Walter, we can't go on like this," he said, holding out an envelope to me. "You're fired. Get your things and leave the office by the end of the day." I silently took the envelope and walked out of the office. Strangely, I felt no shock or bitterness. It was as if it wasn't happening to me, but to someone else. Losing my job meant that now I had even more time to think. Days became an endless series of binges. I'd wake up with only one thing on my mind: where to get money for booze. One day, wandering aimlessly on the internet looking for a way to make a quick buck, I came across an advertisement for an online casino. "Easy money," promised a brightly colored banner. Without hesitation, I registered and deposited a small amount that was left on my credit card. The first win was like a shot of adrenaline. I felt a euphoria that I haven't felt for a long time. From that moment on, gambling became my new passion. I spent hours staring at the screen, betting and dreaming of a big win that would solve all my problems. But my luck was fickle. Every win was followed by a string of losses. I got into debt, borrowing from anyone who would give me money. I didn't care that I hadn't paid my rent in months. The doorbell rang, taking me by surprise. The building manager stood on the doorstep, his face a mixture of disgust and anger. "Mr. Evans, this is unacceptable," he began, pointing to the mountains of trash. "You haven't paid your rent in 3 months. If the situation doesn't change within a week, we will be forced to evict you." I mumbled something inaudible and slammed the door shut. The threat of eviction should have been a wake-up call for me, but instead I just opened a new bottle. The days passed in an alcoholic haze, interrupted only by periods of feverish online casino gambling. I lost track of time, forgot what day and day of the week it was. That's when I realized I'd hit rock bottom. Maddie's betrayal had ruined my life, but I had completed the destruction myself. I'd lost everything: my job, my friends, my self-respect, and now I was on the verge of losing the roof over my head.